Yo, hello. We got two upcoming arcanes. I was under the assumption, as I think a lot of people were, that we were only going to get the one arcane this time around, but they decided to double dip, not only into two arcanes on a single banner, but we also got a second bow coming up. Anyway, you saw the title, you clicked the video, I think you kind of get the drill. We're going to be going over both of the arcanes, giving some recommended builds, and just an overall candidate list of who you do and don't want to give it to, in my opinion. Short, sweet, and to the point, so we might as well get right into the bow discussion. Arcane Darkbow. It is a slaying bow that grants 6 attack and speed during combat. It has penalty neutralization, it has offensive no follow-up, and it has built-in desperation. So any of your fast bows realistically would probably want to run this, especially for the archetypes that don't have access to no follow-up, such as your flyers and your cabs. This is especially really nice just for really good player phase oriented combat. Granted, it is a player phase focused bow, and it does require speed to use, but comparatively to the one we got from Tana, which I'm not going to try and pronounce because I'm generally terrible with that type of stuff, it's a pretty nice upgrade overall for just your speedy bows. I think the one thing that definitely needs to be kept in mind when you decide to use it, if you plan on getting it, is that it doesn't work with stuff like Unity or Legendary Male Robin because it has penalty neutralization built into it. I think that might be one of the few things you may find to be a downside when using the bow. Not to say it's bad by any means, because it's really good as a bow. In fact, it's probably one of our best offensive bows that we have currently. But depending on where you use this, you may find that the scaling in terms of just stat swings isn't going to be nearly as high because of it. But if you don't really use them, then it's not really that big of a deal. And for what it's worth, neutralizing any sort of penalties while you go initiate combat can also be really good for just the ease of speed checks. The one other thing I would like to mention between the two arcane bows is definitely the failsafe. Arcane Darkbow, in my opinion, is definitely a lot better when it comes to a player phase presence, just because of a lot of the stuff it comes with, but it doesn't have any sort of failsafe. And what I mean by that is whether you miss the kill or the foe is able to get their hit first, there isn't any precautionary measures in which you can initiate combat with 100% safety in mind, which again, isn't the worst thing by any means. If you're worried about not getting kills 100% of the time, or you're worried about something like Vantage or Hardy Bearing or anything of the sort, it might be worth considering the other bow, mainly due to the damage reduction built into the bow, and when paired with something like Remote Sparrow, then you end up getting a lot of first hit damage reduction, which a lot of units can't really daunt on their first attack, which is really good. In any case, we may as well just get right into the builds. The one thing you're probably not going to see here are armor builds, because it's a very player phase focused bow, so in most scenarios you're not really going to be initiating combat with an armor like that, and if you are, you probably have other precautionary measures in mind so that if you do have to have that mixed phase utility, you're not just relying on the player phase more than the enemy phase, especially since armors definitely benefit way more from the enemy phase as is. I think due to the effects that the arcane comes with, it is actually a lot more uniform and limited in what you would probably want to give to your infantry units. Granted, that's not necessarily a bad thing per se. You could still use a fair amount of infantry skills because they have a lot going for them at the end of the day. You could use stuff like Hexblade, Ideals, Finish. I personally like the idea of using Ideal with sweeps just so you can make speed checks way more easily. And Ideal currently gives the most attack and speed out of any A slot for an infantry. So that combined with sweep means that you can generally keep the condition up relatively easily and just make speed checks and attack checks way easier. The one other thing that is worth mentioning though is that Spiral Luna is just a generally better Deadeye because it not only cuts into the foe's bulk, but then you're also reducing their damage reduction. Deadeye always had that problem of either just doing way too much damage or just not doing enough, and that always boiled down to how much bulk the foe had. Obviously the ones that were relying on damage reduction were never going to be an issue, but the ones that had a lot more natural bulk really weren't going to get pierced through at the end of the day. And with something like Luna that can then cut it in half and then neutralize a lot of their damage reduction, ends up becoming a lot more effective in the long run, especially for the units that don't have nearly as much attack. The only caveat, at least when it comes to this build, is that you probably want to have some external charge. I personally like having Oath, but it's not the end of the world if you don't have it. The real big kicker is just that you have some sort of cooldown support so that you could get Spiral 4 going on the first combat, which should be relatively easy considering how readily available stuff like Infantry Pulse is. Otherwise, you could try something a bit more fun, where you run something like Escape Escape Route 4 and Fury 3, which is a really nice combo for just getting in and out of combat. Escape Route 4's priority is, as far as I know, one of the last ones. It definitely comes after Fury, but with something like Finish, you can still maintain a fair amount of bulk without just trying to fall below the 25% HP threshold. Granted, 6 damage per combat will make it take a while, but it's not something you just have to chip away at, especially since you could also get true damage from it, which is really nice for damage output. But with Finish healing during combat, Fury taking 6 damage after the combat, you'll then be able to cancel away with Escape Route 4, assuming the foe doesn't have any sort of cancel control present, and you'll just have a lot of flexibility when it comes to your movement in general. Otherwise, you can pretty much just prioritize your damage output. Because it has a desperation effect, you could always also throw it on a Catria Ball, which is really good for just getting quad damage out before the foe can get any sort of attack out, assuming there isn't any sort of outlier or effect that makes it so they get an attack out before that point. With something like Ideal, Oath 4, and Bonus Doubler, you're able to not only meet the conditions of everything there, but you're also getting a consistent amount of attack and speed from your kit. And with Seal Defense 4, you can then inflict another -11 defense during combat, which in a lot of scenarios will allow you to get through most units. I don't think there's going to be a lot of scenarios where this isn't going to work, but obviously there are units that can easily tank this type of stuff. But with Seal Defense 4 and a bunch of attack and speed that you get from your kit, and assuming you also put on a Catcher Ball, which is still optional, although you could always grab that new flashing skill, which is really good, which by the way they didn't have in the builder and I couldn't get the icon, so just pretend that's also an option. Other than that, it's really just a mix of cav and flyer builds that are pretty much going to be looking the same, because unfortunately ranged cavs and ranged flyers don't have a lot of options when it comes to their A's, B's, or C's. Granted, I think their B's are probably the most flexible right now, but that's also not necessarily the highest bar, considering a lot of their options are severely limited comparatively to a lot of the other archetypes. But even so, you can still run a lot of the similar things you were running on the infantry, whether that's Escape Route 4 with Fury, Lull, or even Water Sweep or Wind Sweep if you just want to prevent counterattacks altogether. I think just looking across these builds in particular, the A skill and C skills are pretty much just stuck there because there really aren't a lot of other alternatives. You could always try and go with a joint drive, but that also limits your movement capabilities. And you probably don't want to do that if you are looking to just get in and get out with a lot of threat range. Granted, the only one you'll probably have a lot more success doing that with is with the Escape Route 4 build because it has cancel built into it. And trying to run Far Trace on any of these units is not really a great idea because, in my opinion, Far Trace really just isn't that great. It is nice for the stat debuffs, but in my opinion, Escape Route 4 just succeeds in a whole nother level because it's fixed canto. Regardless, the whole thing is that you just run a bunch of attack and speed boosting skills and hope you meet the check. And depending on what your combat preference is, you could either have some sort of hit and run gimmick, you could have easier speed checks, or you could just prevent counters altogether. And it's pretty much going to be the same thing for the flyers, but the one thing I do want to highlight is the Guidance 4 build, mainly because I think there's a lot more utility that you could do with the flyers and the cavalry, which is something I never thought I'd ever say because ranged flyers have always just been really bad. The Bowens in particular, I think, are actually really decent now. You could give them the new Arcane, and you could give them Catch and Fury and Escape Route 4. Once they're able to cancel away, you can then provide guidance support to your armors and infantry allies, which I think is incredible. So not only are you able to go into combat, retreat back a bit, but then you could also just have a bunch of other units teleport in with guidance. And you could also do this with Soaring Guidance if you want to run a flyer team instead. I think they have a lot of tools at their disposal right now that makes them a really solid archetype. Granted, damage output and just skill accessibility isn't exactly the best comparatively, but I think what they have right now is actually pretty good. And as far as recommended units when it comes to Darkbow versus the old Arcane versus keeping the PRF versus yada yada yada, I think it's relatively self-explanatory. If your unit has a really good amount of speed, then it might be worth giving it to them, mainly because it is one of the best offensive bows that we have currently. I think, again, the only caveat or just downside is that you can't really use stuff like Unity, so if you did end up wanting to put this on a Legendary Robin team, you really can't with the new one, in which case you would probably want to considered the old one, but in my opinion, it's not really the biggest loss, especially if you aren't playing Summoner Duels. And you can still get a good amount of attack and speed regardless of not having any sort of Unity gimmicks with you. As for the rest of the bows that weren't listed above, I think these are a lot of the bows that you either just want to wait for, or you just want to keep their PRF because they generally offer a lot more, or they offer enough on their own to where it's not that big of an upgrade. I think the three that definitely fall into that weird middle territory is going to be Astrid, Ascended Florina, and Plumeria, and that's mainly because they're a lot more supportive in nature. Astrid is definitely just your rally support bot, which is still really, really good, but in terms of combative prowess, it's not exactly that great. So if you did want to ditch her ability to act as a support unit and just basically turn her into another one of those generic combat units, you can with this bow. Same thing with Florina. Florina's weapon is really, really good for something like Aetherraid's Gale Force clears, and it has a lot of warping and movement shenanigans, which is amazing. It does follow a similar suit with the likes of Astrid, where the bow isn't exactly the best on its own, and while you can still run stuff like Remote Sparrow and Brash Assault to help keep up with their combat, I don't think it's the biggest remedy to the point where it's still worth keeping, especially since it could still get shut down by the likes of Hardy Fighter and follow-up prevention and all that stuff, which is a pretty big deal. And as for New Year Plumeria, the big thing is just if you want to keep the dance, otherwise you could just run the old Arcane bow and just give her a regular dance. That's entirely up to you at the end of the day. As for the units that you want to keep the PRF on, I think a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory. They have a lot of really good offensive capabilities. They either have really nice supportive gimmicks, or the bow just isn't as big of an upgrade for them to the point where you want to pull for it. And as for the wait for refine tier, it's pretty self-explanatory. They should be due for refines relatively soon, I think, at least within the next 6 months. So if you want to hold out and see what they get first, it could be worth it. Otherwise, go ham. And that's going to be about it for the Arcane Bow. Next, we have to go into the Arcane Beast Cavstone. I think that's what you call it. Because it has a lot of stuff for a limited archetype that a lot of them don't really want, actually. Nintendo decided that they're going to do a general wide update when it comes to a lot of the refined Cav Beasts. And I'll go into that in a bit because it is pretty significant in whether or not you want to just give this weapon to a lot of your Cav units, which, to be fair, is also like maybe like 10 units. But regardless, it is a Slaying Beast Stone that grants Spectrum 5. It has the Binding Necklace effect, aka it steals visible buffs off the foe. It has true damage based on 15% of the unit's speed, and if the unit is faster than the foe, they get full no follow-up. There's also a new Beast Cav effect where it's based on the amount of spaces moved. You get a bunch of attack and defense debuffs based on how many spaces were moved, and if 2 or more spaces were moved before entering combat, then you get 30% damage reduction on the first hit, which is pretty nice. One of the great things with this is that it's basically just the clash condition, and it works on both phases, so you can still get damage reduction if the foe initiates on you after moving 2 spaces. It's not bad by any means. The weapon itself also isn't really that bad, but I think one of the big issues right now is that a lot of the Beast Cavs just have access to relatively good PRFs, or they don't really want the Arcane if they're trying to fulfill a certain niche. Anyway, before going into the builds, I do want to mention that you can't grab the new Beast Sense 4 skill and the Arcane together. If you want both, you have to pull for 2 of them, which in my opinion is pretty messed up. So keep in mind, as I'm not probably going to be recommending Beast Sense 4, assuming that you're only really pulling for one of these. And again, I think in a similar sense to the previous Arcane, it is very limited in scope and what you could really try and accomplish, and I think a lot of that has to boil down to their skill accessibility. There's still plenty of stuff that you can do because it does have no follow-up built into it and damage reduction, so you can still do a safe initiation thing with Wind Sweep or Water Sweep if you really wanted to. You could do some sort of mixed phase build, which is a bit more gimmicky, but it can still work because you could get a good amount of damage reduction from the weapon and C slot, and as long as you're able to maintain a good amount of health, then you can actually just go in and go out with relative ease and have some sort of enemy phase presence, which isn't bad at all. I think one thing you may want to do is run some sort of healer or some sort of healing support, because eventually you may just get whittled down, which isn't exactly ideal for, you know, damage reduction tanking. The only thing I would probably not recommend is running Surge Sparrow for the mixed phase stuff, because you just don't get any sort of attack and speed in in the enemy phase, and that could easily make or break a lot of your speed checks. But you could use it with a Brash Assault set, and that may sound really dumb to be fair, but you gotta hear me out, right? The Arcane has speed-based no follow-up, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to double if you're faster. You still have to meet 5 points, right? But as long as you're able to get no follow-up going, you can still get a guaranteed follow-up from your B slot. And because it has damage reduction built into it, you can have an even safer initiation, which is really, really good for just mitigating a lot of damage that you would have otherwise taken. And afterward, you could always just heal it back with Surge Sparrow. Damage output-wise, it should also be relatively good, because if you are taking a good amount of damage in the player phase, then you're probably going to retaliate with a lot of damage from Brash Assault anyway. And afterward, you could always just retreat with Alarm Attack Speed and some sort of reposition support. 2 other builds I would like to quickly mention before moving on to the recommendations is a Hidden Run set and a True Damage AoE set. Because, fun fact, that true damage that you get from the weapon works with AoEs, so you can still have a relatively good threat range if you're able to charge it up. That's going to be the big kicker at the end of the day, because Cavalry don't have a lot of special cooldown manipulation gimmicks, so you would have to run something like Valoria or New Year Asker with maybe Quick and Pulse Seal, so that way you can have an instant turn 1 Growing Wind or Blazing Wind, just to get through a lot of the foes. It's not going to loop, which does suck, but if you are able to initiate combat, get that going, and a retreat after, you can still have a relatively okay amount of bulk if Speed Smoke 4 is set up, which is pretty good in its own right. And as for the Hidden Run set, the idea is mainly that you just always have the conditions of the Arcane and Clash active at all times. Assuming you initiate combat, with Hidden Run and Alarm Attack Speed, you could always guarantee that you retreat with 2 spaces. Even in a scenario where there's something like Canto Control, you're always going to be able to retreat back and always have those conditions active for the enemy phase, which will be really, really nice. You do lose out on a fair amount of stuff that you would otherwise get from your B slot and potentially C slot, but I don't think it's the biggest loss, especially if you're looking to make more use of something like Clash and Arcane. But it's not exactly something that you also have to must run, because it's easy enough to also just make it so you can get the conditions going regardless. It's just something that I thought would be worth highlighting if you just want it to be a lot more independent. And as much as I would like to throw Beast Sense into a lot of these builds, you can't grab Beast Sense without giving up the Arcane, which really, really sucks. And I'm hoping in the future they'll make it a lot more accessible, but I don't know what they're gonna do because it's limited. On the final note though, in terms of recommendations, I do think it's not as big as you might have thought. There are definitely units that you do want to give it to, you know, New Year Kaden, Pan, New Year Lyre, Ranoff. There are some that fall into that middle category where you could give it to them, but they also benefit well enough with the weapon they have. Kaden has his Drive bonus doubler or visible buff thing with Null Guard or Guard. I forget which one exactly, but it's a good amount of support that he could grant on his own, which is really, really good. And the Yarns in particular have the Quick and Pulse effect with a good amount of stats in their weapon, so if you did want to Gale Force with them, they're actually one of the better Gale Forces with their PRFs, so you don't necessarily have to get rid of their weapons, especially if you are using them for a Gale Force niche. And as for why there are a lot more Cab Beasts in the Keep PRF category, it's because Nintendo is doing a retroactive update to a lot of the refined Beast cavalry, where if they were refined in the past, you know, we are talking Kaden, Selkie, Pan, Ranoff, they get the damage reduction effect instead of impact, and they get all the debuffs. So now a lot of them ended up getting a pretty sizable upgrade. I think in terms of notable upgrades, it's definitely Leth and Selkie. Leth already has her like Blazing Durando 2 type deal. She has Special Fighter, she has no follow-up, she has extra damage if her special triggers, she gets a bunch of stats. It's pretty good there. Selkie is just a massive stat ball, and one of my biggest concerns with replacing her weapon was that you're losing out on a lot of stats that she would probably need to function because her overall stat line isn't that great. And with the amount of stats that you get from the weapon in dual phase Flow Guard, and now damage reduction, I think it might just be worth keeping. You don't get true damage from not using it, but I think it's going to be a lot more consistent than just relying on the foe to have any sort of visible buff active at all times. I think these are all worth keeping. Freyr is just really slow, so he can't even use the Arcane that well, which is the only reason he's here. If it was a lot more general, then sure, why not? But he has no speed, so it's not really going to be as effective on him. The last thing before I wrap it up is that Freya is due for a remix relatively soon, so you might want to hold off on giving it to her before you see what comes out. It could easily come out next month, or it could be in like 3 months or 5 months. Regardless, it should be this year, and in my opinion, you should probably just wait to see what it does before you decide to fodder off whatever beast skill you want to her. And that's really about it when it comes to the new Arcanes. They're a lot more limited in scope in my opinion, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It just means that you just kind of fall into another one of those categories of they're a lot more uniform with what they do, and if you don't have the specific skills you need them to use, then they're probably not going to be as good. That's kind of what happens when you get an Arcane that just has a lot of really good effects in it. Anyway, if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time, I'll see you later.